Hello and welcome everybody to this week's podcast. We've been out and about. We've been to the Scottish Socialist Party's annual Jim McVicar Memorial Lecture. A really interesting afternoon. This is the 40th anniversary of the miners' strike.
Yes, those of you who are old enough will remember that. It was not a happy time in the UK, some of the things that happened. There were two talks on Sunday afternoon. Was the first one by Alex Shanks, who was 19 when the strike happened. He just started working life as a miner and found himself caught up in that. So it was a very moving talk. When someone's talking from their own experience like that, it really draws you in. Really good.
And then the second speech was Richie Venton, who is the trade union convener of the Scottish Socialist Party. He was commenting on the broader context of the miners' strike and also lessons we can learn in the present day about it.
Yeah, and he's just written a book about it, hasn't he, just to mark that 40 years since then. So we think you'll appreciate hearing these two talks.
This is our history. I mean, it's 40 years ago. It's recent history. And anybody younger than me and Marlene, there are some of you around, we know, you might find this really interesting as well.
So, good afternoon and welcome to the Scottish Socialist Party's 4th annual Jim McVicar Memorial Lecture. My name is Natalie Reid. I'm the national co-spokesperson for the Scottish Socialist Party and I'll be chairing this afternoon's event. And I'll introduce our two speakers in just a moment, but first I'd like to talk a wee bit about why we're all here today. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the SSP lost our well-loved comrade, Jim McVicar. Jim was our national treasure and a founding member of the party. And there'll be many people in this room, including Richie and others, who can talk about Jim's early years in activism and all the work he did. But for me personally, Jim was such an impactful figure. And I think he was for a lot of us that joined during that 2014 referendum time. A lot of us were new to political activism, new to being in a party even, and Jim just made us feel so welcome, and he also instilled in us the importance of being active party members, building the party and being active to support our communities. And he supported us in finding our feet in the SSP. As a lifelong socialist, Jim was of course active during the miners' strike through being involved in miners' support groups in the East End of Glasgow, helping to coordinate the solidarity and support in that community. He later went on to be elected as a socialist councillor. He battled against Thatcher's hated poll tax, against cuts by the Labour Council, and was active in many other socialist struggles throughout his time. He and his wife Christine, who we're so pleased is here today with their daughter Catherine, both gave so much time and effort to building the party and building in their communities, and we're grateful to them for that, and we're pleased to hold this lecture in Jim's honour. So without further ado, I will pass over to our first speaker, Alex Shanks.
It's an honour to speak at this Jim McVicar Memorial event. It's a few years since I've spoken at any meetings. I feel very emotional, but hopefully we'll get through this together. And for those of you who are avid listeners of all things news and current affairs, you may have heard mention a few weeks ago of a special anniversary. But I do say may, because most things at the moment are drowned out by all the noise and flatulence coming from Trump across the Atlantic. However, on the 11th of February, the 50th anniversary of Margaret Thatcher being elected the Tory leader and leader of the opposition. Already christened Thatcher the milk snatcher for stopping free school milk for 7 and 11-year-olds in 1971, Thatcher signalled the triumph of unadulterated free market capitalism within the Tory party and a new stage in the class war. And while the labour and trade union movement in the 70s was busy struggling against the Labour government's pay increase limitations, the Tories prepared for battle and revenge for the victories of the miners in 1972 and 74, which brought down the Tory Heath government. Court was commissioned in 1977, and the right-wing Tory MP Nicholas Ridley recommended that the Tories, when coming to power, should choose the optimum field of battle and the optimum timing for the battle. Should increase coal stocks at power stations, which resulted, when they came to power, from coal stocks increasing from 38 million tonnes in 1980 to 58 million tonnes in 1983. To change power stations from coal-fired power stations to dual coal-oil-fired power stations, which in the end cost £10 billion when the Tories came to power. And to mobilise an array of non-union lorry drivers to move coal during the strike. And finally, to train and equip a large mobile police force to employ riot tactics and to uphold the law against violent picketing. And this plan was all put together 2 years before the Tories were elected. And this demonstrates more than anything else that this was a political attack on the labour and trade union movement to pave the way for further privatisation, for deregulation, for outsourcing, and for the driving down of wages and conditions of working class people. The Tories stepped up in 1981 and they launched an assault on the coal industry. But the miners' response at that time was robust. In fact, there was a ballot in Yorkshire which voted 85.6% in favour of industrial action. The Tories decided that their preparations were not quite ready and they backed away. Thatcher was actually extremely unpopular in 1981 because of the destruction of traditional industries. And she only really won the general election in 1983 because of the Falklands War. The message was clear. If you were working class and you went to war, you were a hero. If you were fighting to defend your jobs, then you were the enemy within. But finally, in March 1984, with the workforce standing at 190,000, the Tories announced the closure of 30 pits with the loss of 30,000 jobs. But we knew via some not so subtly marked secret documents that we had stole from the National Coal Board that the actual plans were the destruction of 70 pits with a loss of 70,000 jobs. So the stage was set for an almighty class confrontation, variously described as a civil war without bullets, or an English Civil War Part 2, which was a description that obviously the Scottish miners weren't very happy with. But the closing down of a pit, as I'm sure everybody realises, was like closing down the whole village. The village was completely dependent on the pit and the ancillary industries. The NUM had a federal, if you want, or a regional structure in many areas led by Yorkshire, Scotland, Durham, South Wales voted for action. And the strike was declared official by the National Executive Committee using Rule 41 of our rule book. And at that time then, the miners were off, particularly the young miners, taking on the traditions of the labour and trade union movement and the miners and sending picket lines all over the country where people were asked not to cross the picket lines and asked not to go to work. Every miner's welfare set up a soup kitchen. And in some of the bigger communities, these soup kitchens were providing 400 meals a day, plus food parcels. We were raising £1 million a week on the streets from working class people who supported the strike. I remember a single parent in Portobello in Edinburgh giving me £5 out of her benefits, and I spent 10 minutes trying to give her it back, but she was adamant that she wanted to support the miners. And that example can be repeated up and down the country. Close to us, this is shouldn't really admit this, but workers at the Drivers' Brewery, close to us at the New Craig Hall Strike Committee, got a small amount of beer as a perk for their job, and they gave it all to the strike committee, so we didn't go short for beer for a few weeks. And the young miners and myself, I was 19 when the strike broke out. We had very little life experience. The strike was chaotic, but we were determined, and it ended up being the most important experience of my life. 40 years on, it's a continual reference point for how society is run, an understanding of class, the establishment, the courts, the media, the police, of equality, of sexism, of racism, of the struggle for gay rights, and it transformed our outlook on society. And although the miners were radical, then as you can imagine at that time, their views on questions such as race and sexism and sexuality were still a little challenging. But that was transformed during the course of the strike. Women, miners' wives and girlfriends went from organising the soup kitchens to leading the strike, to speaking at meetings, to raising money. And when some men were barred from picket lines, then actually taking the place of the men at the picket lines and leading the strike. Kent miners and their supporters were initially surprised when collecting in London with the massive support they received from the black community, who instinctively sided with the miners after the experience of the brutal police attacks on the Brixton riots. In London, and then throughout the country, lesbian and gay support the miners were set up, inspiring the miners' community to be sympathetic to that cause. The miners were pivotal in 1985 at the Labour Party conference supporting LGBT rights, and in 1985 the miners' union actually led the lesbian and gay pride parade in London. And that story was brilliantly told in the highly emotional film Pride. We spread our message internationally, and I spoke at car factories in France, at Renault Billancourt and at Renault Flans. And in April 1984, a Mori opinion poll in the UK showed 68% supported the strike. So despite this enormous early support, this was to be a war of attrition, where the full might of the state was unleashed against the miners, their families and their communities. We were fighting for our very jobs and our very livelihood, and it was an irony not lost on the miners who were on strike, that the right to work, i.e. the right to cross a picket line, was seen as sacrosanct by the media and the ruling class. And in support of that cause, the Tories launched the biggest police operation ever mounted in peacetime UK. In the first 2 months of the strike alone, 220 officer assignments were issued to picket lines. Nottingham, where miners continued to work, was sealed off. Freedom of movement was abandoned. Police stopped 164,000 presumed pickets moving around the country. When there was a mass picket at Orgreave coking plant, there was 6,000 officers on duty, plus police dogs and mounted officers, and there was 8,100 police in reserve. During the strike, over 10,000 miners were arrested. There was police snatch squads operating to target non-trade union activists. Many miners arrested were also sacked. In Scotland, you were twice as likely to be arrested and 3 times more likely to be sacked compared with the other goldfields. And when they ran out of police to swell their ranks, they used other forces, so-called other forces. There were many police at that time who were under 5 feet 8 tall, which was a requirement at the time. And there were many police on the picket lines with no identification numbers on their uniforms, so that you couldn't complain about their activities. I consider myself, in fact, very lucky. I was lifted 3 times during the strike. Once at Bilston Glen, when I was actually trying to behave myself and I was at the back of the picket line, but the police came through the pit and lifted people from the back. When it went to trial, the case was dismissed because the police witness clearly wasn't there on the day and didn't know what they were talking about. At Monkton Hall, I was unceremoniously dragged off the picket line, charged with breach of the peace and fined £200. And when you got charged at that time, then the courts put you on a bail for 3 months not to attend the picket line. Of course, that was bail that every young miner broke. And actually, when I was on bail, I got lifted at Killop Pit. But I was very lucky, because for some reason on that day they must have had a lot of work to do. They let us all go. So while in Scotland, the number of arrests and sackings were proportionally more, the ferocity of the state down south was more extreme. Down south, elements of the police fought running battles with young people in villages like Fitzwilliam. Tragically as well, 2 miners were killed while picking during the strike, David Jones and Joe Green. At Orgreave, 55 miners were charged with riot and 40 with unlawful assembly. A year later, after the strike had ended in May 1985, the trial collapsed. Many police statements were identical and many were forged. And while the South Yorkshire Police paid £425,000 in compensation to 39 pickets, there's still not been any public inquiry. And we recognise that the Scottish Government's amnesty for miners arrested during the strike was admirable. But of course that didn't get people their jobs back, and it didn't make up for the lost wages and pensions that they had as a consequence of getting sacked, which is still an ongoing battle. So we have a picture of a trade union and a community under siege, of a civil war without bullets. So what was the response of the leaders of the labour and trade union movement to this strike and everything that was going on? Was it unequivocal support? Was it to spread support and call for solidarity? Maybe even call for a general strike? As we know, unfortunately not. Their role was to join the ranks of the millionaire press and complain about picket line violence and the lack of a ballot. Norman Willis, or Norman Wisdom as we like to call him, and Neil Kinnock, the leader of the Labour Party, were acting like referees, calling for fair play, when we were literally getting kicked in the balls with our hands tied behind our back. The lack of a ballot was a complicated issue, but first of all we should say that the Tories and the media hated workplace democracy. They hated a show of hands. They hated a workplace ballot, because what happened before these events took place is that there was mass meetings where the issues were clearly explained, and we used these meetings to combat the lies of management and mass media. But as I said, the strike was allowed under Rule 41. The Scottish judiciary actually ruled that the miners' strike in Scotland was legal. And at Monkton Hall, the miners actually voted against the strike, because we were on strike in October and November 1983, and we thought that should have been the start of the national strike. But again, we accepted the majority decision, and we went on to build the strike. And the right wing of the union were no guardians of democracy. Until 1971, we required a 2/3 majority for industrial action in the NUM. And in 1971, it was changed to 55%. However, I have to say, from the bottom of my heart, and with great emotion, we should have had a ballot. Not for democratic reasons, but for tactical reasons, to try and force the maximum amount of unity possible and not allow our opponents an excuse and a weapon not to support us. And on 19th April 1984, the NUM Special Conference again changed the rules and only required 50% plus one for industrial action in the coalfield. And there was a massive expectation that a ballot was going to be called, but for some reason we decided not to, when we clearly would have won the ballot. Anyway, that debate was over on the 19th of April, and from the 20th of April, the priority was to build the strike. Morally, the argument against the ballot was strong against striking miners. Why should people and miners in Nottingham, where they were paid more, where the jobs were perceived to be relatively safe, where the mines were more profitable and in better geological conditions, why should they have the right to vote another miner out of a job and consign that community to the dustbin of history? The Tories and their friends used miners and scabs of dubious moral standing to resurrect a breakaway union in Nottingham, similar to the Spencer Union in 1926. One of the breakaway union leaders was jailed for four years for stealing £150,000 for a miners' charity. David Hart, an old Etonian Tory with Thatcher's ears, travelled 35,000 miles in 3 months to organise the breakaway union. Tim Bell of Saatchi & Saatchi, amongst others in big business, raised £1.5 million to fund the strikebreaker. The media portrayed the miners in t-shirts and jeans as starting violence on the picket line. In the main, there was pushing and shoving to stop the scabs going to work, and police responded with riot shields, truncheons and snatch squads. And later on, after the strike, the BBC were forced to admit, and I quote, they had inadvertently reversed the events at Orgreave to show miners throwing missiles first, rather than in response to a military charge by the police. And Neil Kinnock's "I condemn violence on all sides" was a tragic response from a useless Labour leader. At the 1985 Scottish Labour Party conference, he refused to support the reinstatement of minors, sacked during the dispute, minors who had been through everything and endured police violence. He said he could not condone violence on any side, whatever the reason. And a young minor at that time, speaking from the floor, actually it was me, pointing to the onslaught from the police and that our communities were facing destruction, and that we had been extremely restrained compared to the response of Kinnock the previous week, when he had completely lost the plot and went for a student who had thrown a tomato at him. In September 1984, the courts in England ruled the strike was illegal, as there had been no ballot. The union refused to pay the fine, of course, and a local Tory party official proceeded with the sequestration of the NUM funds. But it's interesting if you compare 1984 and 1977. In 1977, there was a national ballot that opposed the introduction of a divisive bonus scheme, which resulted in big differences in pay across the industry. The right wing of the union and the media and the establishment were desperate to get the scheme introduced, but the ballot went against the introduction of the bonus scheme. At the time, a judge, Mr. Justice Watkins, stated, "The result of a ballot nationally conducted is not binding on the NEC. It may serve to persuade the NEC to take one action or another, but it has no great force or significance." And thus, the scheme was introduced. And thus we can see the courts taking a completely contradictory decision in 1977 and then in 1984, and there the courts acting on behalf of the establishment. But despite all these hurdles, we were so close. And sometimes people don't know how close we were. In October 1984, we had the Financial Times clearly worried about coal stocks and the supply and demand conundrum as the miners were so close to victory. And again, in November 1984, they openly discussed the week the pressure really mounted for the Tories and the ruling class. So it was clear we were very close, if only the leaders of the Labour and Trade Union movement had lifted a finger to help us. And even the best leaders in the trade union movement at the time failed to link the dispute. At the time, Sea Link Ferries was privatised during the strike. Railway leaders settled for a measly 4.9% pay rise when bosses were instructed by Thatcher to give them anything they wanted. 25,000 dockers struck twice for job security. The leaders said it was a separate issue, and in 1989, the National Dock Labour Scheme was abolished, massively increasing job insecurity in that industry. In autumn 1984, NACOS, which was a sort of supervisory union in the mining industry to do with safety, voted 82% to join the strike, and it would have closed every pit in the country. The NUM and NACOS agreed on a joint negotiating platform of no pit closures except on the grounds of safety and exhaustion of repairs. But the NACOS leaders sold out and settled for an independent, non-binding colliery review procedure which did not keep a single pit open. So we were very close to victory from autumn towards the end of 1984. We, the miners' wives, the working class, ensured the kids had one of the best Christmases ever. But as the Tories and the establishment made it through the winter and we got to February 1985, it was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain the strike. So nearly 40 years ago, on the 3rd of March 1985, at the behest of South Wales area leadership, the miners voted to return to work without an agreement. And therefore we have to say, unfortunately, that it was a defeat. And the only victory was that at the end, at least 100,000 miners and their families were still on strike. Scotland voted against the return to work because of the lack of an amnesty for those sacked during the strike, but a few days later they reluctantly reversed the decision. For me and lots of other young miners, return to work was all a bit of a blur as we marched back proudly behind the collar of the van. And then I had to rush off to court that day to face further charges for picket. It was difficult after the strike. People always looked out for each other in such a dangerous industry. But some of the camaraderie was gone. I remember when a steel rope broke and it ended up wrapping itself around my legs. The guys with the ambulance car asked me if there was a scar before helping me on board the ambulance. But while it was difficult, the leaders of the labour trade union movement exaggerated the problems, pointing to the miners, saying if the miners were defeated, no other union can win. But people found other ways to struggle, and the miners' wives and their families piled up the anti-poll tax unions, helping them bring that struggle to victory and leading to Thatcher's resignation in 1990. So I'd like to pay tribute to those who have struggled, and the miners who have struggled over the years. We salute the struggle of socialists and stalwarts like Jim and Christy McVicar, and take inspiration and energy from their courage and commitment. The struggle ebbs and flows. We have come a long way, fighting for every scrap the establishment was forced to give us. Unfortunately, they always tried to take any gains back. It was not until 1900 that it became illegal for children under 13 to work in the mines. 1926 general strike threatened the very existence of capitalism. It was also a protest against crime and poverty, eloquently described by miner John MacArthur from Buchanan in Fife, who later became the Communist Party councillor. He recalls how being the fourth child in the family, he could afford, unlike others, shoes all the year round, as his older siblings were working. Nationalisation of the coal industry after World War II, on the back of a massive wave of radicalisation, was an enormous step forward, leading to one of the safest industries in the world. Before that, between 1873 and 1953, 85,000 people died in the UK mining industries. Despite nationalisation, struggle continued in 72, in 74, in 84 and 85. The establishment, the capitalist media, Neil Kinnock and Tony Blair, after him, all tried to obliterate working people's connection with socialism, but we were always proud of our rule book. And I quote, to seek and secure the establishment of common ownership and control by the workers of the industry and of the means of production, distribution and exchange generally, with a view to the complete abolition of capitalism. The miners still celebrate the mining industry and their achievements. There are galas every year, and there's a North Bury Truth and Justice campaign picnic every year. The biggest of them, the Durham Miners Gala, the big meeting, is in its 139th year, is the world's greatest celebration of community, of international solidarity and working class life. And depending on the weather, there can be up to 250,000 people there. We struggle on, we do what we can do. Don't let the bastards grind you down.
And our second speaker will be Richie Venton, Scottish Socialist Party trade union organiser and founding member of the party.
Some people may have asked the question in their minds, why discuss a strike that took place 40 years ago? What's the relevance of doing so? I think that first of all, Alex's outstanding account firsthand of what occurred helps to answer that, why it's worthwhile doing so. But let me add, this was far more than a strike. It was premeditated class war against the workers. It unleashed the biggest confrontation between classes since the 1926 general strike, with the added difference that lasted 9 days. This was over the period of a year. It defied many of the predictions made by people just prior to the strike breaking out in '84, including some people on the socialist left, that the working class is not prepared to struggle, and in particular that the young miners will not go into battle. They have no tradition of struggle for self-evident reasons if they're new to the job, but also the argument was put that they've been bought off by things like cars, colour televisions and mortgages. Maybe it sounds a bit familiar to you 40 years on. And all wrapping around that was the so-called philosophy of new realism, adopted by the TUC and by the Labour Party leadership of Neil Kinnock and others. In essence, which said that the days of class conflict are dead and gone, a Victorian notion, and what we have to do is accommodate to the fact that there's a new type of society where the capitalist class are dominant, and the best we can do is have realistic dialogue with them in order to reach agreements and get the best we can. It was putting class struggle in cold storage from the standpoint of the working class. But this year-long strike was a display of phenomenal courage, tenacity, of working class men and working class women, ordinary men and women becoming extraordinary men and women through the course of that experience. It also demonstrated the instinctive solidarity that goes with being working class. As a result, first of all, because of the conditions of working together collectively in order to produce things, whether that be goods, commodities or services, it tends to develop a class collective consciousness. It likewise, however, unveiled the lengths to which the capitalist class, the ruling class of Britain and other countries, is prepared to go to retain their power, their profits and their privileges. And for millions of people, it revealed for the first time the true role of the state as, to use the phrase of Frederick Engels, armed bodies of men, a repressive apparatus designed to repress the majority class on behalf of a tiny minority class that would want to rule the roost and get the wealth that goes with it. And as Alex has already sketched out, the tragedy is, and also I have to say 40 years on, the encouraging point is that they could have won, contrary to the way that has been held up since as some kind of example of how you cannot. Now, I would make the broad point that the capitalist ruling class prefer to rule through what you might call bourgeois democracy, liberal capitalist democracy. It's cheaper, it's usually a more stable form of society, it's not always possible in certain circumstances, as for example was the case in Latin America in the 60s, 70s, 80s, as depicted by a current film, I'm Still There, where terror, forced disappearances, imprisonment, torture and death squads were the hallmark of the military dictatorships of capitalism in those nations in the past. Liberal capitalist democracy for the ruling class is a luxury, not a matter of principle. It's a convenient form of rule, but not somehow built into their genes as a form of principle. To quote just quickly two things that were said by enemies of ours. Ian Gilmore was a Tory MP and theoretician, and he said in his book Inside Right, "Conservatives do not worship democracy. For them, majority rule is a device. Democracy is a means to an end and not an end in itself. And if it's leading to an end that is undesirable, then there is a theoretical case for ending it." There in black and white from a leading Tory of that age. Another character that I'll briefly quote that helped to convey the attitude of the ruling class and their military wing was Brigadier General Sir Frank Kitson, somebody that Irish people aren't particularly fond of. He explained in his document or book, Low Intensity Operations, that the main role of the British Army nowadays is not abroad, but for domestic use, dealing with social disorder. And to quote him directly, "If a genuine and serious grievance arose, such as might result from a significant drop in the standard of living, all those who now dissipate their protest over a wide variety of causes might concentrate their efforts and produce a situation which was beyond the power of the police to handle. Should this happen, the army would be required to restore the position rapidly." In other words, a naked expression of the readiness to use the ultimate form of the state in the form of armed forces, the army, against working class people and others if it suited the needs and calculations of the ruling class. Now, after the Second World War, there was an unprecedented economic growth in the economies of the West, including Britain. The astonishing fact is that 4 times as much output was created in 30 years after 1945 as in the whole of previously recorded economic human history. That allowed an expansion of the standard of living on average, relative stability in society, a kind of post-war class consensus between the classes. It healed the wounds of the 20s and 30s in the workers' movement, helping the growth or regrowth of the trade union movement, and it led to a situation where in 1975 wages as a share of national wealth were at the highest ever in Britain, and inequality at its lowest, at the same period as trade union membership was at its peak. But the NUM strike of 84-85, provoked consciously by Thatcher and the regime, was living proof of what had begun to emerge already in the 1970s, that what you might call a golden age after the Second War had been the exception and not the norm for capitalism, including in this country. That the capitalists were hell-bent then on clawing back decisively and forcibly the concessions that they'd made in the post-war period to working class people. That's the broader context of the 84-5 strike. It was premeditated, provoked, and then prosecuted with cold evangelical zeal, and the question arises is why? Well, in the book, that you might have or will buy, I make the point that it's the child of two parents. The revenge by the Tories for the 72 and 74 strikes by the miners and the humiliating defeats that scored against Thatcher's predecessor, Ted Heath, the Tory Prime Minister, including the fact that 74 was the first time, and as far as I'm aware, the only time, when industrial action toppled a government in Britain. And it was also the product of something broader, economic necessity, the need to restore the levels of profit for capitalist big business across the board by conducting a struggle against workers' conditions, salami style, bit by bit, picking off one after another, as prescribed in the Ridley Plan that Alex has already made reference to. And what emerged was capitalism red in tooth and claw. That was unleashed against the miners and continued thereafter, including to one degree or another in the subsequent decades. A small state, low taxation, a switch to finance capitalism rather than manufacturing, obliterated 20% of manufacturing in 2 years in Britain, an increasingly authoritarian rule through things like the anti-union laws to neuter the resistance, including the ability to win back or defend what had been gained in previous decades. And the fundamental problem that the workers' movement faced then, at the time of the miners' strike, and now, is been saddled with the leadership which fails to recognise this reality of class warfare, of two tribes going to war, of no third way or road being available between the interests of an ailing and diseased form of capitalism and the interests of the working class whose conditions are being threatened and whose democratic rights, not just living standards, are being threatened. The ruling class, as I said, prefer democratic rule, manufactured consent, but when necessary, they'll remove the velvet glove and deploy the mailed fist against the working class. We saw that at Orgreave. The Alsatian dogs that were let loose on pickets. The mounted police that wielded truncheons from on high and smashed people's faces in, including people who were sitting eating ice cream on a garden wall in the village after the main battle had subsided, charging into houses like an occupying army, wreaking havoc. Those were some of the methods that were unleashed at Orgreave on the 18th of June 1984. But I first-hand witnessed how that method had been practiced about 6 months earlier in December 1983 at Winnick Quay in Warrington against the print workers in the dispute with the so-called Shah of Warrington, who deliberately provoked a strike by removing the closed shop for print workers in that Stockport Messenger company, where police waded in, snatch squads, violence meted out to us on that picket line as well, a foretaste of what was to come a few months later against the miners. And we saw just a year later, in 86, 87, similar methods deployed by riot police at Wapping when the print unions were challenged by Rupert Murdoch, who was a close friend and ally of Maggie Thatcher, of course, and was out to clip the wings of the trade union movement, and in particular to get rid of those elements of workers' control in industries like print and the car industry, which the unions had conquered in the post-war period through the might of trade union organisation. Of course, we saw as well the mass arrests, or the fact that ancient laws were dredged up as excuses for arresting minors during that struggle, with charges such as the rather bemusing one of watching and besetting, where you were banned from even having eye contact with a scab, and people were arrested for having eye contact with a scab. And that was a clause within the aptly named 1875 conspiracy against people and the protection of property. The protection of property, a reminder by its name of the priorities of capitalist law to uphold the interests of property as opposed to the interests of people. The police were used as armies of occupation in the villages, quite often in order to try and dragoon one scab back into a pit to try and give the impression in terms of propaganda that there was a return to work movement. There was the sackings of 718, well, I've also seen figures of 966 in some publications, and 206 of those in Scotland, including a comrade over here in the audience who lost his job, Alan Ramsey. And of course, we saw the sequestration of trade union funds, a word that is not everyday speech for us, but basically meant theft of union funds and assets built up over the years by workers seized by the state to cripple the ability of the union to function. 14 million hours of police time was spent on picket lines during that strike. It was the use of the police that was absolutely central to the defeat of the miners during the course of that year. It wasn't just police, there was undercover soldiers. Many miners at the time told me, when I lived on Merseyside then, about how they'd spotted their squaddy sons going through picket lines, civilian clothing, driving scab lorries, for example. And many people are of the belief that army were involved in places like Orgreave on that day. There was open discussion and consideration of the use of the army to move coal and oil during the dock strike of July, and later on, because of the strike, or the vote to strike rather, by the pit supervisors, the safety officers of NACODs in October, who were threatening to strike from the 25th of that month. And I think those brief accounts and the graphic descriptions that Alex has made should strip away any vestiges of belief in the permanence or the virtue of liberal capitalist democracy for a generation of people now 40 years later. And what it highlights is that we require a fundamental shift in power to the working class majority in order to defend fundamental rights like the right to strike, to assembly, to free speech, to free organisation. That's why as socialists today, our demands include, amongst many others, disbandment of special riot squads in the police, of spy cops and so on, for democratic control of localised police forces by local authorities and other elected bodies, for trade union rights and the right to strike, for the police and for the army, geared towards helping to break the grip and control of the capitalist rulers over the ranks of the state forces as we aspire to help working class people gain power over the economy, over workplaces, services, political institutions in a democratic socialist state in the future, with elections of all positions, with working class majorities on all boards of management, and with all such officials to be recallable, replaceable, and living on the average wage of a skilled worker. A simple lesson arising from the fact that this strike was, after all, against the nationalised National Coal Board run by a semi-dictator in the form of Ian McGregor on his fat salary. The sceptics and the faint hearts of the movement might say, how could you win when you look at what happened to the miners? And it's therefore fundamentally important to spell out the fact that they could have won. When Thatcher and company threw down the gauntlet by provocatively closing a pit that was expected to have another 5 years' life in Cortonwood, then they dreamt of a short, sharp victory, a kind of industrial Falklands victory for Thatcher. She hoped for a similarly rapid crushing of resistance from the miners. Incidentally, they also probably thought there might not even be a strike at Cortonwood because it had the reputation of being a moderate pit, a pit which workers from previously closed mines had been transferred to, and therefore the idea of fearing for loss of their jobs a second or third time might weigh heavily on them in terms of whether to take action. But despite all the ruling class's preparations, their stockpiles of coal, their coal imports, including from Stalinist Poland, their oil imports increases, including from Libya, their beefing up of the police, their preparation of the scab lorry drivers, amidst 3 million being unemployed at the time, despite all those preparations, they still totally underestimated the response and resistance of the working class, where, for example, the Coal Board had to admit within 2 weeks that only 11 pits out of 174 were working normally. And an emboldened army of miners inspired the wider working class. The women of the pit villages were transformed in their consciousness. They set up the soup kitchens. There was one ultra-left group that scoffed at that as charity work initially, but what they actually went on from was to collect for the food kitchens and so on, the soup kitchens. They went on to go to non-mining workplaces for appeals, to speak at public meetings, to go abroad to speak at public meetings, to organise their own Women Against Pit Closures demonstrations in Barnsley especially, to tour the country and be amongst the best orators in defence of working class people, demonstrating that working class women, usually when unleashed from some of the restraints of domestic, domestic chores anyway, then they become the best and most ferocious fighters on behalf of their class. Phenomenal levels of solidarity right from the early weeks was enjoyed from the wider working class. To sum it up, £60 million in 1985 was collected. That's £240 million of solidarity funds raised from the miners in today's money. Railway workers refused to move scab coal supplies into steelworks and suffered consequences in terms of many that had been victimised and sacked from their jobs. Dockers and seafarers likewise took the brunt for having the same acts of so-called secondary action of solidarity action. And at key points during that year, the government was in a state of panic at a second or even third front opening up. The one that I was directly involved in and most familiar with was the fight that overlapped the miners' strike by about 4 months, the struggle around the Socialist, the City Council in Liverpool. We mobilised tens of thousands of people in the city in defiance of Tory government austerity, in demanding the money back in order to build 5,000 council houses, open up 6 new nurseries, create a 35-hour week on the workforce and a decent minimum wage at the time, to create a freeze on rents and on service charges for various facilities in the community and so on. And we did it by mass meetings, mass demonstrations, starting with one of between 20 and 25,000 of the November of 1983, and then of about 50 to 60,000 on Budget Day in March 84. We mobilised and emboldened working class and insurgent working class in a sense in the Merseyside region with a one-day general strike on the day of the budget being set. And eventually the Tories settled and conceded £60 million, the equivalent of 240 million in today's money, which allowed it to carry out those transformative measures in the city. And one of the fundamental reasons we won that victory was the fact that the Tories could not afford to fight on 2 fronts. But around the same period of the year, the dockers went on strike in July, and there was other disputes as well. In fact, in general, that was a year of record levels of strike days. Of course, most of those were through the miners, but 4.3 million out of the 26.5 million days of strike were from non-mining workers, which was a 25% increase on the previous year. There was a mood for action. There was action taking place on many occasions. And of course, in the case of NACODs, Thatcher was terrified at what the prospects would be if those safety officers at the mines were to proceed with the strike in late October. If you indulge me, I'll quickly quote something that she said. Whitehall was awash with fears that a bandwagon might begin to roll in Mr. Scargill's favour. And later on she said, "We had got so far and we were in danger of losing everything. The management of the Coal Board could indeed have brought down the government. The future of the government at that moment was in their hands." She was considering resignation around that period as Prime Minister. That's how close it was, amongst other pieces of evidence. And if at all those different junctures in the fight, a steeled and principled socialist leadership had existed in a number of other trade unions, they could have spread the action towards some version of general strike, whether it be one day or for longer. And likewise, that was the situation when the miners' funds were seized the very next day, after the NACOD's leadership had caved into a meaningless agreement about a form of words around pit review procedures for closure, which, by the way, didn't save a single pit in the subsequent 10 years. Now, it's true that Scargill and the rest of the leadership made some tactical mistakes. I would endorse the points Alex made regarding the ballot. Not to go back to work and have a ballot, but to have a ballot whilst 80% had walked out would have been a way of undermining the enemies of the strike, including those who were stabbing in the running sore, the Achilles heel of the Nottinghamshire coalfield, which is the second biggest in the country after Yorkshire. But the fundamental cause of that defeat was not whether or not there was a ballot. It wasn't the power of the Tories and their state alone, although that was wielded with full strength. It was the abject failures, the hesitation, and in some cases the downright treachery of other trade union leaders, the TUC, and Neil Down Kinnock, the leader of the Labour Party at the time. It's a harsh reminder, actually, that ideological beliefs become critical in times of intensified struggle. Because the beliefs that they were attached to, I mentioned earlier, New Realism, included having no faith in the working class and their ability to fight, a fear of state reprisals, and their weakness invited further aggression. In particular, the leaderships of the Steelworkers Union and the Power Workers Union betrayed the miners by openly saying, "We will accept scab coal," including at Ravenscraig. And in the spring of that year, or early summer, leaders of the railways, the docks, and other unions settled for extremely modest pay settlements, where Thatcher had said, "Give them anything," because she was terrified of a second or third front opening up. That was at the same time as the battle with the Liverpool Socialist Council was still ongoing. When the South Wales miners' funds were sequestrated on the 30th of July, the TUC threw a deaf ear towards them. When the TUC eventually discussed the strike at this Congress on the 3rd of September, they manoeuvred motions off the agenda, on the one hand from the Miners' Union, on the other from a small outfit called the Furniture and Trades Union, which called for general strike action. And I think it was a mistake by Arthur Cargill, actually, with his authority, to allow that manoeuvre to succeed, because what they adopted instead was a statement about not handling scab coal and oil and coke, but only on condition was discussed in detail with the unions, the individual unions involved, which gave the green light, the escape hatch, to the leaders of the power unions and the steelworkers unions to betray the miners by never implementing that agreement at the TUC in September. When the NUM's funds were seized in total on the 25th of October, that was rapidly followed by the seizure of £200,000 fine on the Transport and General Workers Union, on an allegation of not having conducted a legal ballot at Austin Rovers car plants. And instead of linking that struggle with the miners, the leadership was led by the broad left of the Transport Workers Union, people like Moss Evans and Ron Todd. They failed to link their own battle with that of the miners and cowered in fear of further action, the threat of sequestration, and therefore the opportunity for spreading the action at the time of November disappeared, and the miners were generally left isolated in, around and beyond the Christmas. Now, the miners did not lose because of a lack of readiness to struggle amongst workers, not because of a lack of solidarity from other rank and file trade unionists. They lost because of the crisis of leadership in the trade union movement and the Labour Party, a crisis which, if anything, is even worse today, and in particular is certainly worse in terms of the crisis of political representation for the working class. Since the NUM's defeat, New Realism has been rechristened social partnership. In essence, that's a denial of class struggle trade unionism in the face of capitalist class war against the workers. Neil Kinnock and his New Realism became Blairism, which now, in turn with an interregnum under Jeremy Corbyn, when he was a prisoner in his own party, has become the continuity conservatism of Sir Keir Starmer. And the political outlook, the class collaboration, to give its right name, shaped the outcome of the miners' strike, created its defeat by them being abandoned in the hour of need. And in turn, that defeat in #85 reinforced that class collaborationist outlook at the tops of both the unions and the Labour Party. Cause became effect, and effect became cause. It led, for example, to the defeat of the print unions in '86-'87. Blair's first guest at number 10 had been elected when the hatred of the Tories produced a landslide for New Labour in '97. His first guest was not a sacked miner or one of the women of the pit villages who'd been devastated by the deprivation that ensued after the defeat. It was one Margaret Hilda Thatcher. And she came out with the expression that her greatest legacy was New Labour. And she's right. New Labour became a new capitalist party. It became an openly, unashamedly, undiluted capitalist party in modern times. And the consequences today are profound. There's been a reduction in trade union strength and combativity. Wages as a share of wealth have been reduced. There's casualisation, zero contracts and so on. And the failures of Labour in government and the failures of social democracy internationally in government have opened the door to an upsurge of far-right populism backed by billionaires. But we must not repeat the costly errors of some on the left in the run-up to '84. We must not adopt the attitude that all is gloom, that we're doomed. It's a case of having a bigger picture, seeing the bigger picture, in order to combat and reverse the setbacks ushered in the aftermath of the defeat in '85. Capitalism is in a worse crisis today than in the 1980s. Capitalist labour's hunt for phantom growth means attacks on wages, services, the social wage, and increased inequality, even if there is some capitalist growth for a while. After all, in the years 2020 to 2024, 66% of all new wealth produced was seized by the 1% richest in society. It's true, the huge workforces of the past in coal mining, steel, shipyards, the car industry have largely been obliterated. Manufacturing jobs in Britain have fallen from 17 million in 1960 to 2.7 million last year. It's the lowest number of manufacturing jobs since 1870 in Britain. But that does not mean that the working class at home or abroad have somehow disappeared. The two biggest workforces now in this country are the health service and retail, and they're quite heavily unionised. Nationally, new forces have entered the working class compared to the time of the miners' strike. There's what you might call the proletarianisation of sectors of society that used to regard themselves as middle class, we now have a situation where it's precisely workers in the likes of higher education, further education, and other sections, even including barristers, who've been taking some of the biggest levels of strike action, doctors, GPs and so on, junior doctors, been taking strike action, and that's a replenishment of the forces of the trade union movement, where they're coming into it from previously what might have been regarded as the middle class in society. And globally, the working class has never been as big. For the first time in history, working class people make up the absolute majority of the human race on this planet. There's 3 billion wage earners on planet Earth. It's now a fact that there's 112 million industrial workers in China alone. And the centre of working class organisation has shifted to other countries where, for example, for every one worker in the likes of the G7 countries, there's between 5 and 6 in countries like China, India, Russia, Eastern Europe, Latin America, Africa and Southeast Asia. So what we see is a growth of the working class globally and also a growth of global protest movements. It was reported that the number of protests across the globe increased threefold between 2006 and 2020. And in some of those movements, the idea, at least broadly, of socialism has begun to catch some attention, including the fact that surveys of young people in America indicate that close to half are favourable towards the notion of socialism. And whilst the open displays of class consciousness that we witnessed in 84-5 are not yet returned with full force, there were some glimpses of that in the strike wave of 2022-3, the biggest outbreak of trade union struggle in this country since 1989, where the shared material conditions of different sections of the working class prevented the government from inciting hostility towards that strike wave, for example, amongst train commuters at the time of the railway strike. Another simple fact: social attitude surveys consistently show that the same percentage of people classify themselves as working class as did so in the 1970s and 1980s, between 56 and 60% of the population in different surveys. And that's actually risen in those surveys since the year before COVID, 2019. And COVID, I think, reinforced the notion of class, of the fact there's such a thing as the working class, the one productive, useful class. But still, there's a crisis of working class leadership prevailing. The potential power of the working class was demonstrated by the £3 billion extra in wages and pensions won through strike action in Scotland in 2022-3. But hardly a single one of those settlements matched inflation levels, indicating that the timidity of many of the trade union leaders, including even some of the best ones, left things short of what it could have been. But I think one of the richest lessons of all of the miners' strike is that whilst trade union struggle is central to workers' futures, that most trade union battles are by definition defensive, for a greater share of the wealth within the confines of continued capitalism. And trade unions on their own will not bring about the fundamental and irreversible shift in power to the working class. That shift to power that's required to harness the wealth of society for the common good, and that is necessary to defend and enhance democratic rights, which will always be under threat so long as capitalism continues to rule the roost. The naked display of state power in class war against the mine workers in 84 is a harsh reminder that we need a conscious, organised socialist party rooted in the working class, a mass party which can build and help to confront that power that the state represents in future struggles. And further, to draw to a conclusion, the climate catastrophe that's occurred and been experienced over the past 40 years adds a whole new dimension to the urgency of genuine socialist change and the urgency of building a mass working class socialist party to help lead mass movements for that socialist change. 2024 was the hottest year in human history recorded. Droughts, floods, raised ocean levels, mudslides, storms have created 376 million climate refugees since 2008. And predictions by scientists are that will reach a figure of 1.2 billion displaced people through climate catastrophe by the year 2050. Socialists do not call for a return to coal mining, nor do we call for the continuation of fossil capitalism. But that whole issue of climate change, of fossil fuel production, had absolutely nothing to do with the miners' strike and with the decimation of that industry by the Tories and the capitalist class. It was a question of trying to recalibrate the balance of power between workers and capitalists and to crush the share of wealth that working people could enjoy. And the other point I would make is that we as socialists do not in any fashion suggest that whilst the science says we need to stop fossil fuel production and all that goes from that, we do not believe in what you might call a no-deal exit from that, which leaves the energy workers in Grangemouth in the North Sea. We do not advocate that those workers be turned into the miners of the 21st century, left marooned and stranded without hope, without a job, without a future, as suffered by the miners 40 years ago. The Scottish Socialist Party has persistently fought for a socialist Green New Deal based on public ownership of energy, of transport, of construction, of big industry, of banking, and vitally with workers' control, not the bureaucratic nationalisation that was the National